Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Restart Pod. It is May 1st. And the big thing this week in AI, of many big things as always, is Musk has been suing Sam Altman, Greg Brockman for what is a betrayal of their agreement when they turned OpenAI from a nonprofit to a for-profit company. The trial I think is on. I think they wrapped up their day four at the very last day of April. But there are obviously a lot of questions, things going back and forth, personalities at play, very large ones obviously in the long history here. But Damon, you were mentioning right before we got started, there was a couple of things you had thoughts on that we can probably launch into.
Yeah, so I think just because some of the details are still being, refined and streamed in real time, it's too early to comment on the finality or the totality of it. But I think there are some interesting things at play here that, kind of weave together a lot of the themes that we've talked about on the podcast for several months and kind of even going on years now. I mean, I think high level, it feels to me like both of these parties have legitimate grievances, meaning I think in the beginning, remember this was a decade ago that OpenAI was founded. Right? This thing was founded in roughly 2016, and really didn't even have anything of note until call it 2018, 2019, right when like GPT-2 and GPT-3 were becoming a thing. So my reading, just as a third party kind of external observer, is originally when this was set up, it was impossible to predict where we would have ended up a decade later. Right. Yeah. And so there is some natural evolution that I think had to happen from the leadership at OpenAI. All that said, Elon Musk, originally having provided cash for a nonprofit, was effectively cut out in ways that others were too, right? Elon Musk is not the only person that was kind of excluded from having ownership, let's say, in whatever OpenAI eventually becomes and became. And so I do think there's a legitimate grievance on the part of Elon Musk there that will have to be worked out, and he probably should have some compensation or kind of retroactive bestowment of ownership or something like this in hindsight. All that said, I don't necessarily begrudge the team at OpenAI that feel to me like they're operating with the information that's best available to them, meaning like they simply couldn't do what they endeavor to do or have already done without being a for-profit company, right? So the transition from nonprofit to for-profit is essential to me, and it probably could have been handled better is kind of my high-level take.
Yeah, my take on I think a lot of the AI dialogue right now is one of like the kind of oligarchic personalities at play where it's kind of like factionalized. Like people are very like almost partisan about who they like, who they don't like. But I don't know if anyone could have like predicted how much momentum like an OpenAI would have had pre 2022. And there are there are so many, like if you look at like the number of startups that exist in the world, like so many of them qualify as neo labs and so many of them just like end up being nothing, right? That I don't think for better or for worse, OpenAI is the face of AI generally right now. Like when people think about LLMs and what they're doing in society, they think about ChatGPT. And just by virtue, I think like Sam Altman, Greg Brockman, all these sort of folks, like they've had to be a public face for a thing. As you kind of said, like you're making decisions for a company that you hope do the best that they can. I think the unfortunate thing is I don't think any one of the personalities in one of these big labs, like whether it's XAI and Elon or whether it's OpenAI and Sam, like I don't necessarily think any one of them is less trustworthy than the other. Like they're all kind of like relatively power desiring people trying to make good decisions in like a very volatile and dynamic space. I think it's just unfortunate that I think what is like the founder universe, I think Sam and Greg just don't have great PR representation. Like I don't think that they're really good at like presenting themselves as sincere people as best as they can try. Just like their personalities are not like as digestible as at least like even like some of the trial like transcripts or whatever. Like I think Elon's almost like trying to pose as like if you ever watched Iron Man, like Tony Stark kind of like has fun in the courtroom, whatever, and it almost kind of feels like he's kind of playing into that sort of trope a little bit, more so than like you'd kind of expect for the gravity of what this sort of trial is. There's a lot to me like in regards to like conclusions, whatever. Like obviously the trial's just happening, so I don't expect a lot of dialogue as to outcomes or whatever. But I think it's coming at a time that we're in the middle of like IPO conversations and valuations, and I think there's almost like a level like yellow journalism happening on in both directions. That's making for what is, I think, a difficult position for OpenAI just generally right now. Like they're being very much pushed with like negative propaganda, whether it's antagonistic or not, or by like kind of their own creation.
Yeah, I guess just in closing, my only thought, and that I would share with the audience that I would kind of encourage them to remember, is that if everybody here was acting in good faith, multiple AI companies have been born since OpenAI, and none of them are nonprofit. And the
Yeah.
reality that tells me, including the one that was started by Elon Musk, like
Yeah.
if he was really endeavoring to start a nonprofit AI company that was available to him,
Yeah.
is still available to him. The fact of the matter is the economics do not make sense. You cannot do that. And it's not a defense of OpenAI. It's just simply a reading of the tea leaves. Like, there have been defections from OpenAI. And so OpenAI is far from perfect, stating the obvious. But the reality is you cannot operate a major AI lab on a nonprofit foundation. It doesn't work.
Yeah, like I'm sure that if there's like some version of this like lawsuit, like some alternate timeline where the lawsuit is like Elon gets possession of IP or something, like that'd absolutely be appetizing. You know, it's not like a purely like charitable, like, oh, you guys did bad against humanity and you guys should be punished for that. Like, there's obviously incentives and a lot of competitive elements to what this lawsuit actually is, that I think makes for a pretty. I think OpenAI's position right now is just really like tough. Like, it's not like they're doing anything wrong or like trying anything. Codex has had a big swing. Like, in regards to like the actual product they're providing, like they're in a good spot. It's just I think a lot of the dialogue around AI has, for whatever reason, become very, very negative, and I think is obviously to a lot of competitors' interest to cast that negativity onto one bad apple, which OpenAI, I guess, is like a nice target for, I suppose. Like, we're doing
they're out in
AI
front,
better
right?
than them.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. By most metrics, they're out in front. Like, I think you can argue that Anthropic has done a better job, certainly recently, and maybe even over the course of its entire company history, at acquiring the enterprise. But as OpenAI said many times, like, there's more users in Texas, right?
Yeah.
As an example, than Anthropic has in their entire company. So with, the challenges of being the market, leader, even if that timing is ephemeral, is just that everybody's kind of coming for you.
Yeah, I do wonder. I mean, like, I would imagine the way the current dialogue around AI is, the concept of OpenAI IPOing sounds very dangerous. Like, I can't imagine that's like a appetizing prospect. Obviously, I mean, like, within the inner circles, I'm sure a lot of people would like love to own OpenAI stock. I know, like, if I could own like a collection of any number of these, I would. Like OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI. Like, you just hold on to whatever and hope that one of the bets pays off in the long term. But I would kind of assume in the same way. I mean, this is a nice transition. Like, sentiment around data centers and sentiment around like training and whatever is going really, really negatively right now. Where this week we saw Meta drop by 10%, off of like them announcing investment into more data centers, all this sort of stuff that everyone else is doing anyway. And that's really, really vulnerable when not only are you up against like Elon Musk and Anthropic and all these other folks, but your public sentiment around like people just in general, like a lot of people just don't like AI. Like, that's just a thing. And Claude is not as much in the conversation as OpenAI is. XAI is not as much in the conversation as OpenAI is, which is curious. I'm curious, like, what the internal conversations around this IPOing stuff is, because at a certain point you need money from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got several thoughts on the IPO front. I mean, I think first off, when the public thinks about AI, usually they think about ChatGPT, a few folks are kind of gravitating towards the Gemini or Google products, that kind of thing. From a purely consumer standpoint, Anthropic or Claude really still isn't a known brand, right? Yes, if you're deep in AI, yes, if you're using AI professionally, either because you're building AI or just because you work in some office somewhere that has a subscription, you may be exposed to Claude and Anthropic, but otherwise it just simply hasn't broken into kind of quote unquote mainstream yet.
Right.
And that's okay. That's been deliberate on Anthropic's part. And some people would view that as a strategic advantage. But nevertheless, ChatGPT is kind of the thing that people think about when AI, for better or worse. So that does come with the scrutiny of AI being synonymous with ChatGPT and therefore OpenAI at the moment. And so all of the kind of, as you're correctly articulating, the negative sentiment around AI and data centers and, in some ways corporate greed and the, wealth inequality across the country and the world, it's all being it feels like it's being played out on this argument of whether we are for or pro data center, right? And where those data centers are going to exist and that kind of thing. And so independent of who's building the data centers and who has the partnerships and who's actually benefiting from these things, it just feels like if that is the sentiment around you right now, in this case, Meta, it's negative all the while, which is the kind of funniest thing. And there's a tangent abstract point to this as well, but the loss in Meta stock, right, the kind of decrease in the value over the last week or so, even post earnings, comes at the same time when they've eclipsed Google in absolute dollar ad sales. So they simultaneously have now overtaken.
I didn't clock that.
Yeah, they've overtaken. I don't know what the metrics are specifically. Like, I don't know if that only counts, a number of ads, dollars spent over what time window, meaning over the last year or decade or month or quarter or what, not sure. But the point is it's odd to me that the stock seems to be reacting negatively when they've all of a sudden become the market leader in arguably one of the best, if not the best, business models of all time. So fascinating things there. The meta point that I will, make the meta point about Meta in this case is that I always find it interesting when the stock market moves with one stock or the other in direct reaction to earnings, when objectively, like, all the companies everyone was watching beat earnings. So yet some of them still dip. It's just a kind of a fascinating, I think, experiment in public sentiment, and also going back to your conversation on the IPOs, the danger of being a public company. Like, one of the dangers of being a public company is you can be doing everything right by all accounts, yet you have only influence, no control over the price of your stock. Whereas if you're a private company, you kind of dictate, at least to some larger extent, the valuation that you have because you choose to greenlight it or not, right? You raise at it or you don't. And so you simply don't have these kind of up and down fluctuations, rise and fall on public sentiment pressures that public companies do.
Yeah, like I'm sure, like, both Sam and Dario, like, if they could have it their way, the money that they'd be getting in perpetuity would be based on, like, investors who have had, like, a very long-standing relationship with their companies and have traced how things are going. Whereas, like, and we see it happen on, like, social media all the time, that, like, one of these interviews for one of these dudes will get completely, like, lambasted and clip farmed in, like, a really, really negative way. It's seldom these days for good reason, like, it's always like, oh, Claude Mythos. I mean, like, even this week, like, Claude Mythos came out, and, like, whether or not it's true, like, however far it went, like, people will be like, oh my God, Mythos leaked. And that would probably lead to, like, a big sharp jump downwards on Anthropic stock, which is not the greatest of things, especially if we're still in a phase that things are not cost effective, plainly, right? I do want to talk about something entirely different. There's this post that went out this past week about culture and SF and attitudes to being a builder. Let me see. It's probably actually worth pulling up and sharing screen so it's, like, readable. But there was a lot of dialogue around, I think, this narrative of the permanent underclass of SF, and I guess, like, paranoia around, like, even building right now is to try and, like, almost, like, get out of a, how would I call it, a doomed hellscape of what happens once AI does all the things that AI can do. Here, I'll pull up the tweet that I found quite interesting. Share screen. Yeah, so this tweet from Clara Gold, where she's talking about how she moved to SF. She's talking about how SF is overhyped and underhyped. Commentary here is not so unusual. This is just like saying like there's a lot of people here who are very performative and not actually useful. On the other side, there are people who are like absolute wizards that the labs are fighting over. But it's this that I found really interesting, like these 2, 3, and 4. Two, there are fewer mission-driven people, and this specific line where a lot of people are in a secure the bag before it's too late mode, which I found really true. I think like especially moving to SF like and doing startups, like I started because I was a like idealist almost, like like you try to create the future, all that sort of stuff. But even like speaking for myself, like increasingly it's easy to absorb the narrative of we're all doomed, AI will just keep eating everything you're trying, be a mercenary, get rich and get out. So I'm curious how you reacted to this statement, because there's a lot of stuff here that was like quite negative about the builder like culture at the moment, despite all, but everyone in this group and the folks we interact with are all part of this. I'm curious what your general like read or sentiment is on this sort of thing.
Yeah, so lots of thoughts. First off, I mean, I can't comment as thoughtfully as as you can as far as being in SF. I simply don't live there. You do, so I'll leave that kind of portion of this to you. What I will say is SF, unlike other places, or at least to more extent than other places, exists with the most proximity to AI, and it's just simply unavoidable to think about the ways that is going to impact not just the people there, but society at large. And I think that's what kind of leads to this kind of almost existential dread, right? This kind of in real time viewing of the haves and the have-nots. And I guess the way to make it land for folks that aren't as integrated in that community as you are, certainly, maybe I am by extension, is it's an extreme version of keeping up with the Joneses. I think in this phenomena in which your neighbor has significantly more than you because they were right place, right time, and got hired by one of the right AI research labs where you joined the company down the street, right? And so there's this extreme exponential happening, right? Whereas like owning half a fraction, half a percent of Anthropic is far better than being the next early stage startup founder in SF. And what that's creating, I think, is this almost ideology of I'm missing out. What I will kind of share with the context, and this made me, when you sent that message, it made me think of there's a book that I read, came out in 23, I think early 23. It's called Chip War, and it's by a guy named Chris Miller, and it basically kind of chronicles the history of the silicon wafer, the semiconductor, effectively, and kind of the birth of like Sun Microsystems and a bunch of these companies. And even at that time, there were people leaving remarkable companies to go do other things, strictly on the premise of like, I want to get rich. So I say that, I kind of illustrate that to say, I don't think the timing is so unique in the sense that at the kind of inflection point of other transformational technologies, right? The semiconductor originally, then the internet, probably mobile phone, those kind of things. These snapshots in time do create this extreme stratification of progress for certain cohorts of people, while relative stagnation for other cohorts of people. And I just think what you're seeing in real time is a confluence of this is the most remarkable technology we've seen in a generation, certainly since mobile. But what people are having to deal with in real time is not just the acknowledgement that it might be their neighbors in the context of San Francisco, but they're also living through social media, which wasn't a thing by definition because mobile was the last, kind of step change in technology. So I think you have this extreme keeping up with the Joneses while undergoing a truly transformative technological shift.
Yeah, something I'm finding, like I don't know how to like really like truly process this yet, but even like folks who are non-technical and that stuff, like they just happen to work like a normal day job, basically. Like in SF, they're getting exposure to Claude, and like their bosses are saying like, "Hey, can you make an agent that does this?" and we're obviously in like a time of like pretty unstable employment, where like folks are like trying to figure out their way and like figure out the skill set of expression, whatever. I just actually went to a Duke event here, which was like an AI panel where like Anthropic, like general counsel guy was there, who was a Duke alum. They had representation from like NVIDIA, Microsoft, Google, where the whole panel was like, hey, like, how do you build a career right now is kind of the concept. Um, and it's funny because they've had this panel for the last 3 years. And a question that they ask every year is like, oh, like, what do you think will happen 1 year from now? Right? Like, what do you think the state of the world will be one year from now? And like 1 year ago, the question, like the answer to this question is like, oh, like prompt engineering will be like a new job title, like all this kind of stuff. Like even like it's so easy to forget like where we were a year ago because all of this stuff just like suddenly turned over January. And there's almost this perception right now that we're in the takeoff, that like 2026 was the beginning of the takeoff. Where even those folks, like some of them like inside of Anthropic, are not really like giving statements on like 1 year from now. I don't know, like I guess like just like focus on like being malleable to whatever the current skill set is and just hope that you're like keeping up kind of thing. And even in like even of like peers who are like working in like finance or in legal or whatever it is, like even they're at the point where it's like the only thing I can come up with right now is like just try my best to like rise some ladder in my domain that is like become a decision maker and do not be an analyst equivalent role for whatever my domain is. And that's the best thing that you can like plan for effectively. Which is super interesting. I think like I find even for myself, like in the consulting or whatever I'm doing, like it's almost easier for both myself and the person on the other end to just say like, I'll just help your folks like learn how to use this stuff rather than like be an engineer for you. Because what's the point of me being an engineer if like even now like engineering is becoming like pretty trivial at the software layer, right? Which I don't know. I don't know how to like process it truly. Like I think a lot of this attitude of like even the concept of like don't even build a startup with vision. Just try to assemble a team of like relatively curious and smart people who work well together and just dance enough that you get picked for an acqui-hire at one of these labs is almost like every now and again tempting. And I see that playbook happen here every like couple of days. You know, like it's very clearly like three like Stanford grads or like some MIT folks who like don't have a plan, but they all know like the kernel layer of an LLM running, and they'll just focus on tinkering with that loudly, effectively. And that becomes their startup plan, which is very much not what like Silicon Valley was, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's some element of, again, I guess existential dread that is being felt among people that are adjacent to the technology. Certainly the folks that are in the labs themselves. I find planning to be a little bit of a exercise in futility just for the things that you said. It feels, even trying to guess where we're going to be 6 months from now and a year from now feels very challenging. That's uniquely challenging for me, given my day job is somewhat prediction based, meaning like, take a bet on this startup or take a bet on that startup. And so we certainly have some frameworks in which we think about it. But what I will say is throughout the history of everything everybody can remember, the things that have been rewarded are curiosity, agency, ambition, a willingness to just do things even in the face of uncertainty. I think it's possible that those things will be more emphasized, but I don't actually see a fundamental change there. Yeah. I do think, to your point, and not trying to kind of just sweep it under the rug, I do think it's far harder to advise like an 18-year-old today to say, this is the thing you should be studying. These are the core competencies you should be learning because we have a pretty clear picture of what your future is going to look like in 10, 15 years. Right? I do find that answer to be very challenging to define right now, but I don't find it any different to say, remain curious, continue to do things with high levels of integrity and agency, and you're going to be rewarded. The specific vector of rewarding, again, feels unknown to me, but it's very hard to believe that very smart, very capable, very thoughtful people aren't going to continue to win out as new opportunities present themselves.
Yeah. Well, that was a good note to end on. That was very positive, I think, unusually. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, y'all, for joining. We'll, I mean, I'm sure the Sam Altman OpenAI stuff will resolve into more this like later, like next week. So we'll catch y'all then. And thank you for joining. Peace.